Welcome to AT2, Closing the Gaps, Is It Useful? I'm Glenn McMurtry and I'll be presenting this information today. First of all, an acknowledgement of country. I would like to begin by acknowledging the Turrbal people, the traditional owners of the land that we gather today. I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and I extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. Also, a content warning. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander viewers are advised that the following presentation may contain images of people who have died. Okay, an overview of today's presentation. We're going to be talking more about this Closing the Gaps report that came out in 2018. It's been updated in 2020, but I just want to explain what exactly are these gaps, what the report was all about, and what progress has been made in those gaps. We're also going to talk about some key principles for addressing closing the gaps that you can incorporate into your lessons. So I've got some pedagogies towards the end. And there's also a learning activity or quiz just to see that you've been listening. Okay, so what exactly is closing the gaps? Well, you might recall in February 2008, it was the Rudd government that issued a formal apology to Indigenous Australians for the forced removal of Indigenous children from their families. This was known as the Stolen Generation. So that was February. Not long after, in March, that same government agreed to work with Indigenous Australians to achieve equality. So what happened was the COAG, the Council of Australian Governments, introduced a strategy. But what they came up with was they saw the gaps between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, and they set some long-term targets to try and reduce those gaps, or not have a gap at all, ideally. Okay, so the gaps they identified were child mortality, early childhood education, school attendance, reading and numeracy, Year 12 or equivalent attainment, employment, and life expectancy. So let's just take a look at how things have progressed from 2008 to 2018, in some cases 2020. So we've got the child mortality rates here, 0 to 4 years. Now, as you can see here, the Indigenous population is far higher than a non-Indigenous population. It is trending down in both cases, but there still is an unacceptable gap between the two. Next, we'll move on to early childhood education based on enrolment. So this is just 2018, and this is one area where we are moving beyond our targets. We do have a slight one here in the Northern Territory. There still is gaps, mind you, but we're on target here for our 10-year 2008 to 2018. The Northern Territory here, early child education enrolments, that has a lot to do with geographical remoteness in some communities. Okay, moving along to school attendance. We've got school attendance here. Still, there still is a gap, but it starts to really become apparent sort of after about year 6, 7 onwards. Now, bear in mind that this initiative is just over 10 years old. Now, most year 5, year 6s are around 10, 11 years old. So this group from year 7 onwards was really part of before the 2008 agreement was initiated. Now, moving on to literacy and numeracy, I had to pull this from the 2018 report. The 2020 update really didn't have a good enough table here that I feel expressed this information well enough. As you can see here, the gap is quite apparent between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians, but it is narrowing. Look, slightly in some cases, but again, it's narrowing at generally the year 3 and 5 levels more so. So our gaps here, we can see where our gaps were in 2008 here, 2017. We have narrowed the gap but we still have a long way to go there. So, okay, just looking at the Year 12 attainment rates. So this is the national Year 12 or equivalent attainment rate for 20 to 24-year-olds, 2008 to 2019. Indigenous still lacking, still a gap present, but it is improving, fairly constant among non-Indigenous Australians, but we are seeing some improvement. At least here we're on the right track. Life expectancy, 2015, 2017, we've got males, females, still a noticeable gap there. A lot of work to be done between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So we can have a look here at the progress we've made between state and territories here and see which categories we're actually succeeding in and which have a lot more work to go. Now this information here, these dashes here, child mortality information is collected state by state, and it really is disproportionate between Indigenous populations between states. But overall, there's still a gap persisting there. Where we're really on track here is early childhood education. So across all states, just that little bit of a gap I pointed out within the Northern Territory, mainly to do with geographical remoteness, but overall on track. School attendance, still gaps. Literacy and numeracy, we still have gaps. This year, 12, look, the majority, I guess you could say, or at least half the states and territories, we are on track for the equivalent of or Year 12 or equivalent attainment. Look, a little bit of work to go in some states, but overall trending the right way and meeting targets. Employment, we still have a bit of an issue there too, a bit of a gap. So I will just go back to employment rates here. 15 to 64-year-olds. As you can see, quite a large gap there. Targets are getting there, but still a lot of work to go. We do have, in fact, slightly less than 2008 at the moment. So no, employment rates, no, not good enough. So, okay, now just back to this progress here. So really, only 2 of the 7 categories here are currently on target. There's a lot more work to be done in the other 5. So, all right, I'll just have a look here at the resources I've used and resources that can be particularly useful in the classroom for incorporating and closing the gaps into your own teaching. So we've got the Prime Minister's 2020 report of closing the gaps. To be honest, more of an update I found. The 2018 report was far more comprehensive. We had the National Indigenous Australians Agencies, so NIAA, which was a great source of information. And the Closing the Gaps actually has a public website. So that one's useful as well with a lot of good information. So the key principles, what we want to take away here, we want to really use and implement these AITSL standards 1.4 and 2.4 in our learning environments. So strategies for teaching Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students, understand and respect Torres Strait Islander people, to promote reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So we can start with using the appropriate terminology. You can seek advice from Indigenous Australians, especially elders, and be more active in the community when it comes to Indigenous affairs. We've really got to understand the impacts and importance of closing the gaps here. It benefits us all as a society. And we can also acknowledge country, which is a large and important part of Indigenous culture and tradition. So the things to consider when you're teaching in the classroom and trying to incorporate closing the gaps is the learners have an opportunity to use statistical data. These graphs and tables that are provided in the Prime Minister's report are absolutely fantastic, and they do highlight the stark differences that exist between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Australians. So the lessons should explore and discuss issues regarding the Indigenous population. And you can discuss the impacts and consequences for all in the community if these gaps persist. You can promote strategies to reduce gaps, and learners have appropriate time to absorb and interpret data and the consequences of these gaps existing. Right, so some of the pedagogies that we can implement into a classroom environment. So we can develop classroom pedagogy that analyses and confronts our national identity. So this is what O'Dowd was mentioning in 2011, and we talked about extensively in AT1. Facilitate lessons that guide learners to focus inwards to examine their own assumption of Indigenous Australians and culture, and address the silent apartheid many learners may have. Now, this is many learners that have come or a product of an education system that suppressed and devalued Indigenous Australians and culture. Okay, and finally, the learning activity and quiz. What year did the COAG identify gaps and set targets? The answer was 2008. And how many areas are there in closing the gaps? Well, if you want to refresh your memory, we'll come back here to, there we are, we have 7 of them, 7 of these key gaps that we want to address and close. And finally, how many key areas were on target in 2020? Well, look, unfortunately, only 2 at this stage. We've still got a lot of work to go to close these gaps. Okay, thank you for listening.